The sun hung low in the sky, a fiery orb that seemed to burn hotter with each passing year. In the small coastal village of Grove, the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. The once thriving fishing community had seen better days. The ocean, their lifeblood, had become unpredictable. Storms raged with increasing ferocity, and the fish that once filled their nets were now scarce, driven to deeper, cooler waters by the rising temperatures. For the people of Grove, climate change was not a distant threat or a political debate. It was their daily reality. Elena stood on the weathered wooden dock, her eyes scanning the horizon. At 32, she had already witnessed the slow unraveling of her world. Her father, a fisherman like his father before him, had taught her to read the tides and the winds. But the old rules no longer applied. The sea was a stranger now, capricious and cruel. She adjusted the wide-brimmed hat on her head, shielding her face from the relentless sun, and sighed. The catch had been meager again, barely enough to cover the cost of fuel for the boat. She thought of her younger brother, Tomas, who had left the village 2 years ago to find work in the city. He sent money when he could, but it was never enough. In the distance, dark clouds gathered, a harbinger of yet another storm. Elena's heart sank. The last storm had destroyed 3 homes and flooded the market square. The village had no money for repairs, and the government's promises of aid had yet to materialize. She turned and walked back toward the village, her boots crunching on the cracked, dry earth. The once lush fields that surrounded Grove were now barren, the soil too salty and depleted to sustain crops. The villagers relied on imported food, which was expensive and often spoiled before it reached them. As she approached the village square, she saw a group of children playing near the old well. Their laughter was a rare sound these days, a fleeting reminder of a time when life was simpler. Elena forced a smile and waved, but her thoughts were heavy. She wondered what kind of future these children would have. Would they, too, be forced to leave their home in search of a better life? Or would they stay, struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to push them to the brink? The impact of climate change was not confined to Grove. Across the globe, communities were grappling with the consequences of a warming planet. In the arid plains of sub-Saharan Africa, farmers watched helplessly as their crops withered under the relentless sun. Droughts that once occurred once in a generation were now a regular occurrence, leaving millions without food or water. In the crowded cities of South Asia, the air was thick with smog, a toxic mix of pollution and heat that made it difficult to breathe. Heat waves claimed thousands of lives each year, and the monsoons, when they came, brought devastating floods that swept away homes and livelihoods. In the Arctic, the ice was melting at an alarming rate. For the indigenous communities that had lived there for centuries, the changing landscape was both a physical and cultural threat. The ice was not just a part of their environment, it was a part of their identity. As it disappeared, so too did their way of life. The animals they hunted for food were migrating further north, and the permafrost that had long supported their homes was thawing, causing buildings to collapse and roads to buckle. Even in the wealthiest nations, the effects of climate change were being felt. In the United States, wildfires ravaged the West Coast, turning entire towns to ash. Hurricanes battered the Gulf Coast with increasing frequency and intensity, leaving behind a trail of destruction. In Europe, heat waves shattered records, and rivers ran dry, threatening agriculture and industry. The economic cost of these disasters was staggering, but the human cost was even greater. Lives were lost, families were displaced, and communities were torn apart. For scientists, the evidence was clear. The Earth's climate was changing at an unprecedented rate, driven by human activities. The burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, and industrial agriculture had released vast amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, trapping heat and altering weather patterns. The consequences were far-reaching and interconnected. Rising temperatures led to melting ice, which in turn caused sea levels to rise. Warmer oceans fueled more powerful storms, while changing weather patterns disrupted agriculture and water supplies. The delicate balance that had sustained life on Earth for millennia was being upended. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, the response to climate change had been slow and uneven. Governments and corporations, driven by short-term economic interests, had been reluctant to take meaningful action. International agreements, such as the Paris Accord, were a step in the right direction, but they fell short of what was needed to avert catastrophe. The transition to renewable energy was underway, but it was not happening fast enough. And while some communities were adapting to the changing climate, many others lacked the resources to do so. For Elena and the people of Maris Grove, the future was uncertain. They had always been resilient, but there was only so much they could do in the face of such overwhelming forces. The village elders spoke of the old days, when the sea was bountiful and the land was fertile. They warned of the dangers of ignoring the signs, of failing to respect the natural world. But their voices were often drowned out by the demands of the present, by the struggle to survive day to day. As the storm approached, Elena helped her neighbors secure their homes and boats. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow streets, and the first drops of rain began to fall. She thought of Tomas, far away in the city, and wondered if he was safe. She thought of the children playing by the well, and of the world they would inherit. And she thought of the ocean, once a source of life and hope, now a symbol of uncertainty and loss. The storm raged through the night, tearing roofs from houses and flooding the streets. When morning came, the village was in ruins. But amidst the devastation, there was a glimmer of hope. The people of Maris Grove came together, as they always did, to rebuild what had been lost. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew they had no choice. The fight against climate change was not just about saving the planet, it was about saving themselves. In the years that followed, the world began to change. The urgency of the climate crisis could no longer be ignored, and people everywhere began to demand action. Grassroots movements sprang up, calling for an end to fossil fuels and a transition to a sustainable future. Governments, pressured by their citizens, began to take bold steps to reduce emissions and invest in renewable energy. Corporations, facing growing scrutiny, started to adopt more sustainable practices. But the fight was far from over. The impacts of climate change would be felt for generations, and the window of opportunity to avert the worst outcomes was closing fast. The story of Maris Grove was just one of many, a microcosm of the challenges and choices facing humanity. The choices we make today will determine the world we leave for future generations. Will we rise to the challenge, or will we falter? The answer lies in our hands. As for Elena, she stayed in Maris Grove, determined to fight for her home and her community. She became a leader, advocating for sustainable practices and working to adapt to the changing climate. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that giving up was not an option. The ocean, once a source of fear and uncertainty, became a symbol of resilience and hope. And as she stood on the dock, watching the sun rise over the horizon, she felt a sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but she was ready to face it, one day at a time.